Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today, and welcome. So I'm Andrew Harris, I'm Director of Campaigns and Alumni Relations at the University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our latest session of Bright Minds brought to you from your university. This webinar series has been created for our alumni and friends to showcase the varied, the exciting, the impactful research that is taking place at your university. So it's wonderful to see so many alumni and friends joining us today from all over the world, from different academic and professional backgrounds. And our topic for today is music, and what our choice of music says about us, our emotions, and our levels of empathy. So today's speakers will focus specifically on how music making in synchrony with others can promote social bonding, and secondly, how our music preferences might reflect aspects of our cultural self and how we express our emotion. So I hope you're looking forward to hearing today from today's speakers, so PhD students, Persefoni, Tzanaki, and also Jaytee Tang, and from Professor Nikki Dibben, Faculty Director of Research and Innovation. And I'm sure Nikki will tell us a little bit more about music, but we're exceptionally proud of our Department of Music at Sheffield. We've got the distinction of being a Steinway school, a first in the Russell Group for the quality of our teaching, and sixth nationally for our research environment. And special thanks go out to our alumni and friends who do support music with their talent and also with their charitable giving. And alumni have recently helped secure 2 new conductors in residence for the Sheffield University Symphony Orchestra and also for the Wind Orchestra. So thank you very, very much indeed for that. So today we'll begin with a short introduction by Professor Dibben, followed by the 2 presentations. And after the talks, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions to today's speakers. And we expect this event to last an hour. So before we get started, if you don't mind, we'll go over some housekeeping items. So you better know how to participate in today's event. So to allow all participants to have the best viewing experience, we have turned off your cameras and your microphones. And you may find it helpful to enable the show captions at the bottom of the screen there that I am reliably informed brings up some subtitles. As we have had in previous sessions, a little bit of challenge with being able to hear properly. So, there is that function there. If you would like to submit a question, please do so in the chat box, which is along the bottom of the screen. So not in the Q&A box, but in the chat box. And you can open the chat box by just clicking in the bar. And as time allows, Persa, Jaytee, and Nikki will answer as many questions as possible. We are going to be recording this webinar, and this webinar will be available again on our Bright Minds section of our webpage, and also we'll be putting that on the Sheffield Player, which is our version of maybe the BBC iPlayer, and that can be found at player.sheffield.ac.uk, and we'll give you the link at the very end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Nikki Dibben. Nikki.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Andrew. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to talk to you today about the Department of Music and for you to hear about the research of 2 of our fantastic PhD students. In particular, I'm not going to say much actually about the music department today, but just to put this in context, at Sheffield, we have kind of 4 main areas of work that we do in music. One of them you're going to hear about in detail today, which is the psychology of music. So both of our doctoral students that you're going to hear from work in that area. So you'll find out a bit more about what that is. But we also, of course, have colleagues and students who make new contributions in fields beyond that. So, for example, ethnomusicology and folk music is a particular strength. You may know the work of Faye Heald, for instance, who's a sort of renowned folk singer and recording artist who is one of my colleagues here. Composers, but also musicology ranging from Italian Renaissance art and music through to American Hollywood musicals, the music of Mozart, and of course a whole load of varied areas around that, just to pick out a few. But those are the main clusters of work that we work in: musicology, ethnomusicology, psychology of music, composition and performance. So what is it that a music psychologist does? I'm just going to share my screen with you just for a moment to show you a couple of things. So let's just do that. Yeah, so what is this strange area then, the psychology of music? Maybe you've come across it before. I know there was a previous presentation in this area within this program of events, for example. Well, a music psychologist asks questions about people's musical behavior, their thinking, and about musical sound. And what we're trying to do is to answer questions about that using empirical methods. So observations of the world collected through all kinds of methods like, interviews, controlled laboratory experiments, field work, many different approaches. And the kinds of questions that we address are things like, how did human beings come to be musical? Why is it that we're a species of animal that are musical? Are there universals? So in other words, are there, is it that people organize sounds in the same way across the world? And also, what's the relationship between the acoustics of sound, things that we can measure, and then actually what we hear? So it's more in the realm of the psychoacoustic. How do our bodies respond to music? And how can we use that to influence our health and our well-being? And also our behavior, actually, if you think about advertising and other forms of persuasion. Also, why do people have strong emotional reactions to music? And why is music able to seemingly unite people, but also divide them? You only need to think about football chants or slogans and so on, or political singing for that, to exemplify that. So here at Sheffield, we have one of the longest established cohorts of staff and students in this area in the world. We have the first distance learning programme in this subject area. And we've got two fantastic research centres. There's Music Mind Machine, where we conduct research into kind of applications of music and kind of blue skies thinking about music that's related to cognition and perception. So, for example, at the moment, we've got a large project developing music technologies for older people and people with dementia and their carers. We have a collaboration with UK pop and experimental musicians investigating how artificial intelligence can be, what form we want artificial intelligence to take in the future of music, not just about its problems and its challenges, which of course we're hearing loads about today with ChatGPT, for instance. And also questions like, how do listeners perceive emotion in music? And that's where Jaytee's, Jonathan's topic will come in today. And how do performers synchronize their movements and timing? And what does that synchronizing with other people do for us and do in the world? And that's where Perse's work comes in. And a second strand of research and education in this area is the social psychology of music. And you can see these things overlap to quite a big extent. So our other research centre, the Sheffield Performer and Audience Research Centre, is investigating why people, for example, go to classical music concerts, or why more people don't go to classical music concerts. And we're working with organisations influencing the way that they market and promote themselves, but drawing on a whole history of research in the social and applied psychology of music to do that. So there are many questions in what we could ask about music, as I hope I've shown you. And actually, many of you submitted some fantastic questions about music, which I hope we have a chance to talk about later after the presentations. But there are so many. What have we done is to choose two topics in particular that Perse and Jaytee are going to talk to us about, so we can delve more deeply into just two of those topics. So this is a deep dive into two particular areas in this much larger realm of the psychological study of music. So if you want to find out more about what we do and keep in touch, please do. There's some contact details there, Twitter ones, but you can find us obviously through our website if you do want to follow up on anything that you hear. So now what I will do is I will pass over to the first of our two speakers. So I'm going to pass over to Persa, who is going to talk to us about the work that she's been doing, looking at the reciprocal relationship between empathy and interpersonal synchronization. I'm going to just stop sharing now. There we go. And Persa is in the third year of her PhD, so not finished yet, but kind of in the data collection and analysis stage, and having great fun doing that. So Persa, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Nikki. Thank you for this introduction. Let me just share my screen with everyone. All right, so hopefully you can see my screen fine. So hi everyone, and thank you for being here, for attending this webinar. My name is Persa, and I'm a PhD student in music psychology here at the Department of Music. And my background is in education and music, and I'm also an alumna, University of Sheffield alumna. I did my master's in psychology of music about 7 years ago. And currently I'm working with Renee, Nikki, and Jenny on a project that is looking at the relationship between empathy and synchronization when people come together and they play music together. And these two terms might seem a little bit unrelated at the beginning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each term separately, and then I will move on to talking about how these two relate to one another. So we'll start with empathy. So what is empathy? Empathy is our ability to put ourselves into another person's shoes. It's the ability to understand their emotional state, to understand their thoughts, or see the world through their eyes and see the world through who they are. It remains a quite complicated concept in psychology. There are lots and lots of different definitions and some different kind of like beliefs and theories about its origins and the brain areas that are involved in empathy. But what is commonly accepted is that empathy can either be affective or cognitive, or these two things might happen at the same time. So we have affective empathy, which is the more automatic part of empathy, is when we, for example, see someone having a sad face, we automatically know that they are sad. We can understand how they might be feeling. And then we have cognitive empathy, which is a more conscious part of empathy. It's when we try consciously to understand a situation through another person's perspective, basically, to understand how they might be feeling in that specific situation. And empathy in general is seen as a personality trait. So it's something that we develop in life and it's part of our character. But we also have more specific, like a situation-specific empathy. It relates to a specific situation. So you might be very empathic, but you might struggle to empathize with someone who is threatening your life or someone who was late at a meeting. So it depends really on the situation and the people who are involved in a particular interaction. Let's move now on to synchronization, the second term. So synchronization.
Hi, Persa. Sorry to interrupt you. I have a habit of talking quite fast, and so I wondered whether also you might slow down a little bit. It's great. It's just that I'm suddenly aware that there might be people who need to have a bit of a slower pace of speaking, and I apologize as well if I was talking a little bit too fast in my presentation. So yeah,
no problem.
Okay, great.
No problem. So synchronization comes from the Greek words syn, which means together, and chronos, which means time. So basically it means being together in time. And synchronization can be spontaneous. So let me just move them to on. So you might have experienced like being in a concert, clapping at the end of the music, and you might realize that you are doing exactly the same thing as the person next to you. So it's when you align your movements with someone, and that happens very spontaneously. And it can also be intentional. So it's when, for example, we want to lift up a heavy piece of furniture. We just say 1, 2, 3, and we lift up the furniture, and we do that together, and we have planned that. So it's like we plan this movement so that we can achieve a shared goal. So synchronization can happen in different elements, different aspects of life. But in this particular presentation and in my research, I will be focusing on intentional synchronization in the context of music. So that's when people come together and they play music and they synchronize their movements to achieve this musical goal. And I will be focusing on adults and children who have little or no previous musical experience. So I will not be talking about musicians who synchronize their movements. I will be talking about people who don't have that background in music. And I might refer to synchronization also as synchrony. These two terms can be used interchangeably. So I might say synchronization or synchrony. So let's move on to the link between empathy and synchronization. So research in music psychology and social psychology sees synchronization as a social glue, as we call it. And that is because when people synchronize their movements, it has been found that this can lead to higher social bonding. So being synchronized bonds people. It makes people feel closer to one another or more similar. And also, synchronization can lead to higher empathy. So there is a research that has found that when children engage in musical interventions that involve synchronization, and they do that over a long period of time, that can lead to increased empathy. So their empathy can actually be higher at the end of this musical program. So we can see here an effect of synchronization onto social behavior in terms of social bonding or empathy. But then we can see this link between synchronization and social behavior from a different direction. So there is research that says that people with higher prosocial tendencies or people with higher empathy are better at synchronizing with a peer. So we can see here how social behavior in terms of traits and skills can actually have an effect on synchronization. So that shows us that perhaps musical and social behavior have a bidirectional relationship. They share an interplay. There is an interplay between those two behaviors. And because this is quite big to investigate, I decided to focus specifically on synchronization and empathy, investigate the interplay between those two capacities, and hopefully that can help us understand better the relationship between musical and social behavior in general. So I spent the first year of my PhD looking at the literature, the existing literature, empathy and synchronization, and I created this theoretical model that is called the positive feedback loop model of empathy and synchronization, which basically says that when people come together and they play music, they utilize their empathy skills to synchronize better with their peers. So we go from the yellow boxes to the orange box. And then this achieved synchronization helps them increase their empathy or helps them empathize better. And that can increase their empathy in the long term. And then this increased empathy can lead to better synchronization. And this loop continues like this. So the feedback loop, the positive feedback loop, means that when we have an increase in one aspect of the loop, we get an increase in the other aspect of the loop. And this loop continues. And one capacity affects the other simultaneously and continuously. And this model, this loop, can have some implications for children and adults. And because my research focuses more on children, I will mention here two implications for children. So future research could design musical interventions that use this loop to create a program that promotes children's simultaneous musical and social development. So imagine a musical program where children can practice their synchronization skills and empathy skills at the same time. And that can happen continuously and simultaneously. And this loop can also be used for a musical intervention that promotes similarity, closeness, and empathy across intergroup members. So people who come from different groups and initially might perceive themselves as separate or different from each other, maybe an intervention that utilizes this loop can help them bridge the gap or the differences they have and perceive themselves as more similar. Of course, like going now to the empirical side of my PhD, so that the actual research, the loop is quite big and it's difficult to investigate this loop in just a PhD program. So this is something that I'm planning to do later. So what I've been doing in my PhD is 3 separate studies that investigate some aspects of the loop. And hopefully these aspects will be like pieces of a puzzle that I put together and that will help me design a study in the future, a more like longitudinal study that focuses specifically on the loop. And because when I say to people that I do research in music psychology and empathy and synchronization, people have questions like, so how do you measure empathy, or how do you do this and that? So I decided to tell you a little bit about my third study that I just finished. I just finished collecting data a few weeks ago. So I think by talking about this study, I might answer some questions you might have as well, related to how things have in this area happen. So this study, it took place in Greece, my home country, and the two main questions I tried to answer were, first of all, I wanted to see whether empathy helps children synchronize better, so whether children use this trait empathy they have to synchronize with their peers. And then I have the second question, which is looking at the opposite direction of this link. I want to see if synchronization helps children empathize better, and I'm talking in terms of state empathy, the more situation-specific empathy. So I want to see whether when children interact musically and they synchronize their movements, whether that has an effect on their empathy. So the study had three stages, and the first stage was measuring empathy. So I gave children a questionnaire that is designed to measure their empathy. I didn't mention any words like empathy to children. I just gave them a questionnaire which had 30 statements, 30 sentences like the ones you can see over here. And I asked them to circle their answer depending on whether they do what the sentence says, rarely, sometimes, or often. So an example was, I can put myself in someone else's shoes when they describe being happy. So children had to think about it and circle rarely, sometimes, or often. And you can see two more examples as well here. Like if I saw my friend being made a fool of, I would feel uncomfortable. Or seeing someone enjoying a tasty dessert makes my mouth water. All these are related to cognitive, affective, or somatic empathy, which is more like how we experience empathy or the feelings of someone else on our body. So after this questionnaire, children participated in the first task that was looking at the first question I mentioned, the link between empathy and synchronization. So pairs of children came into the room, and I asked them to imagine that they are in a band and they play music together. And I asked them to sing a song, to sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star in Greek. I gave them claves, and I asked them to play together and copy each other and pretend like they are in a band and they're playing music together. And I have an example here to show you how that works. Hopefully you were able to hear the sound. So I had some cables connected to these claves, and I recorded children's playing. And as you can see here, this is an example of the recording. So I have recording all these taps. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate the distance between the taps. So as you can imagine, the smaller the gap is, the better the synchrony between the children was. And I will be able as well to see whether children with higher empathy had smaller differences between their taps. I haven't analyzed the data yet. I just finished collecting the data. But what I'm anticipating to find is that children with higher empathy are better at utilizing these empathy skills they have to understand the emotions of another person. And they use them to understand the rhythm of the other child and adapt to that rhythm and synchronize better. And this is something that has been found in adults, and I'm hoping to find the same in children. And the final part of the study was looking at the opposite direction of this link. And what I did, I first measured children's state empathy at that particular moment before any interaction. Then the children interacted with one another, and then I measured their state empathy again. And state empathy was measured again through a questionnaire, which had questions like this, like, can you guess the emotions of the other child? Do you think you can understand how they might be feeling? It was questions like this, and children had to answer yes or no or maybe. So children answered these questions, and then I gave them some headphones and they listened to some music, and I gave them some percussion instruments, and I asked them to play along with the beat of the music. But what the children didn't know was that some of them were listening to the same music, but at different speeds, different tempi, as we call them. So that was kind of like as we say in research, I experimentally manipulated synchronization. So I created a situation where children couldn't synchronize with each other. So I had a synchronous condition and the asynchronous conditions, so that I could see whether these two conditions have an effect on state empathy. And again, I haven't analyzed the data, but I'm anticipating to find that those children in the synchronous condition experience higher state empathy. And that is because synchrony creates a social channel between the people, and that allows them to understand each other's emotions and empathize better. And when that synchrony doesn't happen, it's like there is an interruption in that channel. So that asynchrony is like it encourages children to isolate themselves and not share their emotional states or empathize with one another. So that's all about my study. I hope this has come to answer some of your questions. And just to finish my presentation, I just wanted to say that empathy and synchronization, there are still loads that we need to find out, but it seems like they have a quite multidimensional relationship. And this relationship highlights a possible interplay between musical and social behavior in general. And that is because musical interactions are actually social interactions because they involve people. And if we combine this relationship with our universal love for music and dance, we can create some really powerful musical interventions with significant implications for children and adults. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to answering your questions later. And before that, I will hand over to Jaytee, who's going to present his exciting research, and then we'll come back and answer your questions. So Jaytee, off to you. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Persa. I'm just going to share my screen now. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for having me present. So I'm going to present on my research, my PhD project, which is looking at music, the role of self in cross-cultural investigations of affective experiences with music. And before I start, I kind of want to invite you all to go on this journey with me. I invite you all to maybe on a piece of paper, on your phone, or wherever. You don't need to type this in the chat. I want you to think of responses to this question. Just answer this question, who am I? And you don't need to answer it as though you're answering for someone else, just answering to you, answer to yourself. And you can do this as we go along, and I'll explain the significance of this in a bit. And while you're doing that, let me introduce who I am. And so my name is Jaytee. I come from the sunny island of Singapore, which is in Southeast Asia. I am a musician. I played at quite a lot of different venues internationally as well as in Singapore. And in addition to being a musician, I am also a music therapist. So I trained in the US. I worked as a music therapist in the US, in Singapore, as well as in the UK. And that's kind of who I am. And part of the reason why I came to this research was because I noticed some interesting things that were happening when I was working with my clients. Everybody can hear that? Great. And when I was working with my clients in Singapore in a group setting, I'll play the song. I think you know the song, and if you want to sing with me, you've got a friend in me. You've got a friend in me. When the road looks rough ahead and you're miles and miles from your nice warm bed. And it's getting sunny now, so that's great. So, when I presented this song, people became animated. They started talking about themselves. I was such a good friend. I did this for that person. I did that. I'm great. I'm big. I'm strong. And then I did another song, which is kind of a Chinese equivalent of that. And the title is called 朋友 by Zhou Huajian or Emil Chao. And the chorus kind of goes like this. 朋友一生一起走，那些日子不再有，一起忘了一辈子，一生情，一杯酒，朋友不曾孤单过。And I won't sing the whole song, but That's a song, "朋友" is translated to friends. And you know, when I presented the song, although it's about friends, like the other song, people became a bit more reserved. People became a bit more quiet. They were a bit more reflective in the way that they were responding to me, and in a very I want to say in a very Asian way, they didn't talk about themselves anymore. They started to say, oh, you know, my mom did this, or my brother did that, or my friends did this. So the topic didn't become about themselves, and that led me to my research and looking at how culture influences affective experiences with music. So I don't have much time, but I hope to bring you on this journey to explain why I'm doing this research, some of the background as I was looking at the literature. I'll give a little taste into what my research, what I did in my research, and some findings that I have found so far. So why is this important? So we all know, hopefully we all have had some experience with music that stirred emotions in us. Music elicits a whole range, right? Music can make us laugh, it can also make us smile, but it also can make us cry certain times. If you think of what hurts the most is being so close, right? So maybe a sad song can make us cry sometimes. And affective experiences or emotional experiences of music may be an important aspect for why we engage in music. But the thing is that when I was looking at the literature, most of the research is weird. By weird, I mean Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So the samples that is mainly from Western countries, is all maybe Western European, white people. And so even in my music therapy training, we didn't have that much research on people from diverse cultural backgrounds. And so I really wanted to explore that. Do people from different cultural contexts behave in the same way? There's a contemporary discourse around anti-colonialism or decolonizing music research, and there's a lot of debate now about having better methods in terms of investigating cross-culturally what's happening. And so I hope to, through this research, add to some of the findings in terms of what's happening cross-culturally. So what has previous research found? So if we take a look at how does culture influence experiences with music, that's kind of the trend, the thread that we're examining. And we want to examine first, what does culture mean? So Marcus and Kitayama defines culture as this expansive set of material and symbolic concepts such as world, environment, contexts, cultural systems, social structures, institutions, and the list goes on. And very often when I talk to people about cross-cultural research, the first thing that my parents ask or people ask me is like, oh, which cultures, which countries are you looking at, right? So people always think or equate culture with countries, and it's very often like, you go to a Chinese culture, you go to China, there's this Chinese culture, you go to maybe Greece, there's this Greek culture, and yeah, sure, there's one aspect of culture. Another aspect of culture people are familiar with is cultural systems, and I'll explain a little bit more. And this is also reflected in the research, right? There's a lot of research that looked at comparing people from different countries. There's research in cultural psychology that does that. There's a lot of research in music psychology that does that as well. So they would take people who, for instance, they would present, for example, Midya, that put that list there. Yeah, Midya presented Hindustani Indian classical music to people who lived in India and people who are not living in India. And that's cultural differences there. But it's not quite insightful, right, in terms of what it can explain or how it can give more insights into how culture impacts or influences affective experiences. Another way that people have looked at is that the cultural values, and these are just a lot of different ways that different psychologists have come up with different cultural values. I'm sure a lot of people know this big term, individualism versus collectivism, and people tend to associate, people of the West are individualistic, people of the East tend to be collectivistic. And research has used this individualism, collectivism domain in research as well. I didn't put down all the details there, but even in music psychology, Sacravilo, for instance, they sampled people from Finland, for example, assumed to be having an individualist kind of perspective versus people from India with a collectivist kind of perspective, and looked at how they responded to music. And for people from Finland, they rated music to be more empowering for them. For people in India, they rated music to be more peaceful, transcendent kind of music. So when we look at what previous research has found, they've typically examined people from different countries, different nationalities, or different ethnicities. And that's just one part of the picture. Oops. I'm just going to see that I can see my slides. Oop, there we go. So what my research is looking is considering the role of self in music and emotions. So I want to bring you back to the definition by Marcus and Kitayama, where they further explain that culture is not separate from the individual. Being a person, a self, requires input from social cultural meanings and practices, and the self is the center of awareness and agency that incorporates and reflects these social cultural patterns. In turn, people's thoughts, feelings, and actions reinforce, sometimes change the social cultural forms that shape their lives. So it's not that, just because I'm from Singapore, I am a certain cultural being, right? Individuals interact with the context they are in. And it's not that you are, just because you're Chinese or you're Greek or you're British, you subscribe to a certain cultural worldview. No, that's not what it's saying, that we as individuals have some level of agency in deciding how we want to act. And so previous research has examined this environment and context. The part that I'm focusing is on the self, the individual level, and how previous research has examined the environment and its influences on the self in music, but I'm also looking at how the individual responses influence, or the music has that reciprocal relationships with that. So going back to this diagram, what my research attempts to examine with effective experiences with music is in 3 domains. The first is in music preferences, in perceived emotions, what do the songs express, and how the music makes them feel. So, and what I'm doing is through examining the self. And the self in cultural psychology, they've identified this independent view versus the interdependent view of self. And from a certain cultural context, it does influence the self, of which the self then influences our affective experiences with music. So if we take a closer look at the self, there's these 2 broad concepts, the interdependent and then the independent self. So I invite you to take a look at your responses to that first question that I asked, who am I? If you put down terms such as, I'm a brother, I'm a teacher, I'm a manager, then you have what we call an interdependent view of self, that your self is not just you, but it's more interconnected with other people, with friends, with your family members, with certain social groups that you are in. If you wrote in your description that I am strong, I'm creative, I'm funny, then we would say that maybe you have a more independent view of self, or independent self-control, and that's where the self is just you, right? Your self is not defined by your social relationships with other people, and you can see that these 2 are kind of put over there. And there's a lot of implications, there's a lot of research out there showing how these different self-controls affect the way you think, the way you behave, and some of the emotional experiences that you experience. So I'm going to share some preliminary findings from a large-scale online survey that I did. And just to share, excuse me, an aspect of music reward, right? When you listen to a piece of music, maybe you get certain rewards, maybe you feel happy, or in this instance, what I'm looking at is social reward, that, when you listen to a piece of music, you feel a bit more bonded with another person. So there is actually no differences between nationalities and countries if we compare the level of social reward between people in the North and South America versus the UK, Europe, and Asia, there's no differences. And if you compare between race, ethnicity, there's also no differences there. So my PhD is nonsense. No, it just means that we need more nuanced ways to see what cultural differences are there. And so if we look at, again, the big model that I'm thinking of, country as one level, in this case race, does affect our worldview in terms of whether you are independent or whether you have an interdependent view of self. And I just wanted to highlight that the views of self does influence or predict social reward. And you can see that the coefficient here is higher, meaning that for interdependent people, when they listen to music, the social reward that they get is higher. And again, that in statistical analysis, what we call here is that there's a mediation effect. So race itself does not necessarily predict social reward, but it is mediated through this concept of self, that the self explains or can predict this social reward. So if I just take a look at this direction here, for the Black and Hispanic people, they are less independent than white people, but the level of independence does have some influence on whether they experience social reward when listening to music. So this is just a quick snapshot of some of my findings. There's a lot more findings. I'll be happy to talk and share with you. And this is just, again, a brief overview that, culture is not just the context or the countries or the race or ethnicity, but it's also through the self. What kind of self do we have as a result of our control of the environments that we are in, or what view of self do we adopt when we engage in music experiences? So I'm going to leave it there. Feel free to connect with me, and I'm sure we'll have a fun time of discussion after this. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop my screen share here and I'll pass it back to Nikki.
Thanks so much, Jaytee, and Persa as well for your presentations. We've got now about just under 15 minutes for some discussion and questions. There are some clarification questions which we can deal with in a bit, but I just wanted to start off with some of the questions that have been sent in before this session. And there was one in particular. I should just say, I think one of the really interesting things about what you've both presented is this idea about the kind of mutually constructing nature of musical experience. So to some extent, you're both talking about not just the way that the kind of music is kind of helping us bond, for instance, in your case, Persa, but that our ability to, our empathic abilities are both shaped by music, but then they also influence our ability to entrain. So it's a kind of mutual, circular thing. And Jaytee, with your work as well, this idea of music not just being something that kind of expresses our identity, but helps form our identities and our sense of self and who we are. So thank you both for that. So one of the questions that I won't say people's names because I'm not sure if I can kind of anonymous or not, the people that sent in the questions, but I'll try and say them in a way that you might recognize them if you're here with us. One person asked, I'm intrigued to learn more about the direction of the relationship between empathy and active social music making, and what musical elements, if any, might be key to that relationship. And I wondered, Persa, whether you had any thoughts about that, whether there's anything in particular about musical materials that mean that empathy, social music making is afforded by certain kinds of material. And later in the same question, Jaytee, this individual goes on to ask about, say they're a music teacher and they're interested in what this means for musical identity, and in particular, what the role of personal taste and preference might be. So I wondered whether you might say something relating to your work on musical preference in relation to self-construal as well. So Persa, I don't know if you wanted to respond to that question about the relationship between that and particular musical elements.
Yes, of course. Thank you all for your questions. In terms of the elements, I would say that, synchronization is one of those elements that exist in active music making. So when we make music, we want to synchronize so that we can have a cohesive result. So synchronization, it's one of those elements, and I think that's the link between music and empathy. The synchronization might be that link. But of course, that doesn't mean that whenever we synchronize, we empathize and everything is perfect. That would mean that whenever we play music, or that would mean that all musicians have super empathy, or that would mean that we don't need to do anything else in life, just play music and we'll be a happy society. That doesn't really go like this. There are, of course, lots and lots of other elements that play a role. And I think there were a few questions in the chat about like cooperation, or someone said about, if people come together and they do something else, that also might increase their empathy or their social bonding, which is true. So I would say that it's a combination of factors. And then what we do in research here is like we're trying to isolate things. We know that that's not very realistic, and we talk about like ecological validity. So we sometimes create some experiments. We know that we isolate things that might not be exactly realistic, but we want to see the effects of one thing onto the other. And then we introduce that back into real sort of like contexts, and we add things and we see the effects of all those things. So I would say that when people come together, they share an experience. That itself, it's very powerful and can increase social bonding and empathy. But then music creates a context. It gives that common ground that makes people come together and synchronize their movements. And of course, when they cooperate, when they share something, they want to do it again. They want to do it more. They might want to do it better. So they synchronize even better, perhaps, or they are happy to see what the other person is playing and sort of like make a step closer to them. So I think it's all these elements that when they are combined, we can say what we have with a loop. We can see that, from empathy, we go to synchrony and then back to empathy. So it's a combination of lots of things.
Yeah.
So,
and in particular, I mean, the music that people are playing plays a part in it as well, doesn't it? Of course, because the kind of music that you're engaging with will encourage a particular kind of interaction potentially. So if you think about different, musical genres and how some musics, this is very kind of crude example, but if you think about I don't know, something like a Beethoven symphony, for instance, or one of my colleagues might be talking about, we can't all join in or synchronize in that. You have to have, a virtuosic or, very highly trained performers to do that. So that's not, it's a presentational form of music. It's not a music that's made for participation by a large group of people. Whereas, of course, there are many other kinds of music which are indeed allowing people to engage in a way which is much more participatory. So it's about musical materials. What kinds of interaction does particular piece of music allow people to have? Yeah.
I just to add sorry, Jaytee, just to add a little thing. I like the last study I mentioned with the headphones. I did something similar with adults, and I asked the people some questions after this experiment, and I told them, how did you feel when the other person couldn't really synchronize with you? And someone said, what? I didn't really like it, but I liked the music, so it was fine. I had a fun time. So I felt close to them. So you can see there that actually the music, the type of music or that shared experience was stronger than the actual synchronization. So there are lots and lots of things that we need to kind of find out more about.
Thanks. And Jaytee, I wondered if you wanted to sort of allude to the work you've been doing on musical preference in relation to the end of this question, which was about, well, does it kind of to do with preference? Does it matter what your preference for music is, I suppose, broadly, and where that comes from?
Right. I mean, I think, so part of my research is also looking at, in the survey that I gave out to them, I asked them to state what's their favorite piece of music of all time. This is a bit different from what previous research has done, and they would say, list your favorite genres, and genres is quite broad in that sense. And nowadays, if you say pop, what is pop? Is pop Michael Jackson, or is pop Miley Cyrus? And they can be quite different in that. So I was trying to be a bit more specific, and in terms of music preference, it can definitely reflect maybe who you are. And there is research, I think I'm just going to quickly answer some previous another question there in the chat, that in previous research, what they found was that in Chinese pop music, that there's a lot more interdependent themes. So there's themes related to the lyrics, reflected themes of giving back, filial piety, being grateful to your parents, as opposed to in Western American pop music containing more individualistic themes of like empowerment. You think of Miley Cyrus Flowers, I can buy myself flowers, right? It's all about I, me. As opposed to Chinese music, if anybody listens to Chinese music, is about unrequited love, is the longing for someone. And there is that tendency for that music to be like, I think someone mentioned in the questions that, yeah, the music tends to be a bit more somber because the lyrics and the content does talk about those kinds of things. So back to the question of music identity, maybe exposure to all kinds of music and exploring different genres of music would help with figuring out somebody's identity or figuring your musical identity. But it's not like a bad or wrong choice, right? It's not like, oh, hip hop is bad, we should not listen to hip hop. Or, Miley Cyrus is where she's swinging on this. I don't know why Miley Cyrus is on my brain now, but like Miley Cyrus swinging on this wrecking ball thing is bad, or Lady Gaga with her seashells or something like that. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but as it's just an expression of maybe who you are. And so part of my research is going to dive a bit deeper into the responses and seeing, are there themes, not just in the lyrics, but maybe in the music as well. Maybe in independent theme songs tend to be maybe a bit more upbeat, maybe a bit faster. I don't know. That's part of my research that I have to plow through my online survey of 450-ish different songs. So I'll keep you posted on what I find.
Thanks, Jaytee. I just noticed someone said they made the point that, well, surely maybe listening to music rather than just making music, maybe listening to music can influence people's is a form of entrainment, passive synchronization or entrainment, and how can that influence people? I didn't know, Persa, whether you wanted to respond to that.
Well, yeah, that's a whole kind of like different sort of like sub field of what I'm doing. So it's about synchrony, we call it. Well, what I've been focusing on is interpersonal synchronization, so it's between people, and there's also the synchronization of your brain and your body with music. And that also can be very powerful. There is a research that says, I think, if I remember very well, they asked people to listen to music and synchronize with music, and it was music from different cultures, I think. And then they also measured people's empathy, and they found that listening to music from a specific culture made people sort of like have a more kind of like a tendency to prefer a group from that culture. And then people with higher empathy had stronger preference towards that culture. So again, there is something about that synchrony, not just when you synchronize with other people, but also when it's just you and you synchronize with the music. There is also a whole lots of research about when we synchronize with the music and how we perceive music as an actual thing, like as a person, or the people who produce the music, or the singer behind the music, or lots and lots of different elements that makes that also a bit of a social experience as well. But I'm not an expert in that area, and I'm not sure exactly what else is out there. But yeah, it's definitely very interesting. I'm not sure if you, Jaytee, you have come across something more about that. It's like about it's more like about the response to music. And
yeah, no, that's that I would say that's the iconic study, Persa, the one that you cited. But I think that's by Clark, Vygotsky and Denora from a few years ago. But also University of Oslo recently been running what are called kind of live labs, where they're hooking up people to, all kinds of sensors during live music concerts to exactly look at this question of what happens in a live situation. That's one of the questions that came up that was sent to us. What happens in a live situation of music making? Are people, in training to the music physiologically? How does that, what does that look like across, a mass of people in the audience? So yeah, now that we've got kind of technological, we've got sensors and we've got kind of computing power to actually look at the data effectively. We can actually look at this in live situations as well. There's a really interesting question Combian, I think it is, has posed to you, Jaytee, in the chat. I didn't know if you wanted to respond to that, if you've seen it. It's asking, is it the case that culture shapes some aspect of our affective faculty, which in turn shapes how we experience music?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, exactly. And it's hard to say, pinpoint which direction in terms of whether culture affects us and then we engage in music in a certain way. So in one thought, you can say, yes, my upbringing in a certain cultural context predisposes me to emote in a certain way, which then influences the way I engage in music. So unfortunately, I'm not looking at ways that people are engaging in music. I'm just looking at how people respond when they're listening to music. So in terms of what the arguments that I'm saying is that, people with a certain interdependent or independent self are drawn to a certain style, certain type of music, of which there's certain type of music, when we talk about perceived emotion, is what is the song expressing. And I have some preliminary data saying that, for interdependent selves, the songs are expressing more interdependent emotions, which is in cultural psychology literature, they would say socially engaging emotions, emotions that make people, draw people together, as opposed to people with independent selves drawn to music that is more independent, more driven. So going back to Miley Cyrus, you can think Flowers, you can think of Ed Sheeran. I'm trying to diversify my pop music references right now. I can't. And those themes of like me, I, or if you watch the Greatest Showman, right? This is me. I am brave. I'm strong. This is who I am. This is me. So that's that power kind of thing. And just to make it even more complicated, when we listen to those kinds of music, it can also causes us to adopt those kinds of subject positions. So, when I put on a certain piece of music, I might want to act or emote with what that music is expressing. So that you can see how that culture and self and music choices kind of interacting one another. Me, culturally, I am drawn to a certain piece of music, and the music is making me, it's reinforcing some sort of emotional response from me. So it's quite hard to tease those dimensions out, but a very good question indeed.
I am so sorry, because I would love to carry on this discussion and to hear and also see the wonderful questions that you've all sent in. The questions that you've asked are really valuable. Thank you so much for those. If I don't know whether Jonathan and Persa, if you want to reply to any of the clarification questions that are in the chat, you could do that. But I'll now have to hand back to Andrew, and just to say thank you both very much indeed, and thank you all for your questions.
Nikki, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for this evening. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Persa and also for Jaytee for giving us that fascinating insight into their research, and also Jaytee for that burst of music. I saw in the chat someone mentioned that music can be more powerful than words, and I think that's very true from what we heard today. So Nikki, thank you also for that interesting introduction to this session, and also for hosting the Q&A, to the Alumni Relations team for putting on this event, and of course a big thank you to you all for attending. If you have enjoyed this event, please do take a look at our Bright Minds webpage, where you can look at previous webinars on that particular page. And today's webinar will be posted up there next week. As I mentioned earlier, please do look at the University of Sheffield player. So that's player.sheffield.ac.uk, where you can watch and also listen to a whole variety of content from across the university. So this is our one place where we're going to showcase everything that the university has to offer. So the web address will be shared in the chat. And please do take a minute or two to complete the short feedback survey, either now in the chat or in the post-event email that will be sent shortly afterwards. And do get in touch with us directly if you would like more information about anything you've heard today. So thank you once again for attending this Bright Mind session. And whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are, have a great rest of the day. And thank you very much indeed from us all. Thank you.